sexuality and holistic sexuality. But to start it off, we're going to talk about sex positivity. So has anyone heard that term before, sex positivity? All right, somebody want to explain what it means or their understanding? Yeah.
Sierra speaking. For me, it would be an open-mindedness towards sex and a willingness to do sex.
Okay. So open-mindedness and a willingness to even talk about sex or sexuality. Okay, there were some other hands. Same thing?
Yeah. Alex.
So it's this overall understanding of being open, talking about it with honest communication, and really just this underlining understanding of sex and sexuality as a healthy part of development, right? As who we are as people, by ourselves, and in relationship with others. So you already touched on some of these. It's openness, non-judgmental attitudes, feeling as though you have freedom and liberation within sexuality. All of that comes into this idea of sex positivity. So typically, there's kind of been an evolution of the idea of sex positivity. So there's a comic up here that hopefully you can see some of it, but to explain a little bit, there's kind of this traditional vision of sex positivity as being like a reaction to more like negative sexuality education. So I don't know about you all, but by a show of hands, like, what if you were to say that your sex ed that you got in school or in your life was more focused on like what not to do? Raise your hand if that's kind of more, okay, yeah. So a lot of people, right, get that type of sexuality education where it's all about like just risk, minimizing risks, right, preventing things, preventing like infections or pregnancy, rather than looking at sexuality as like all of who you are and all these different elements of who you are. So that's kind of, so when sex positivity first kind of started to happen, it's this idea like, let's move away from this negative view of sexuality. But in some ways, that kind of created some silencing of other people as well, right? Because like you brought up earlier, not everyone might be comfortable with sexuality, right? So if we just switch it and go totally to this other side and we're like, hey, sex is great, let's talk about all the things that make sex great, it's only positive, people only have positive experiences of it, you can imagine that that might silence some people as well. Right? So what might be some experiences that aren't included in that? Yeah.
It's painful or uncomfortable, or you don't enjoy it.
Okay, yeah. If someone just doesn't like to have sex, or when they do, it's painful, it's uncomfortable. Other ideas that might not be included in that vision of just sex is great, and we're only going to talk about the fun or exciting things of sex. Yeah.
You don't see the kind of sex you want to have represented in porn.
Okay, yeah. It's a great one, right? So being like, okay, so if we're going to be talking about sex positivity, then maybe I have to like or be into sex that I see in porn, and that's the only way that I can be like pro-sex or sex positive. Yeah, that's a great example. Any other thoughts from anybody? Yeah?
That you might have like a negative experience with it to begin with, and then move on to like a healthy relationship.
Yeah, so like past experiences, right, that people have that might be negative, whether that be like abuse or just relationships in the past. Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into people's experiences of sexuality. And so what this comic is illustrating, and what I think, our goal today is to have conversations about sex and sexuality that are all-encompassing of this wide range of realities that exist for people, right? And for the experiences that we're all bringing to the table and into this conversation today. So, as I already mentioned, we're moving away from that more fear-based model of risk management and negative outcome prevention. Like, some of those things are important, right? Like, it can be helpful to learn about sexually transmitted infections or birth control methods, but it's not all of what we're going to talk about when we talk about sexuality. So then with that, just to make sure that we are in an environment that, the range of experiences and feelings that exist can come out and feel comfortable here, a lot of times it can be helpful to set what are called like group agreements, things that we all agree to while we're having this conversation together. So one of them, we already kind of brought up today, this don't yuck on my yum. And there was a question like, can somebody please explain what that phrase means? So somebody want to take a chance and see, how would you explain don't yuck on my yum? What that might mean? Yeah.
So like if somebody has a fetish or something like that they really like and really enjoy, and somebody's just like, oh, why would you do that?
Right. Like if you're bringing that up and talk about it and someone else in the room is like, like that someone could feel really like, oh, yeah, that's a thing I really enjoy, I like, and now there's this perception of it out there that doesn't feel good that happened. Yeah, so that's don't yuck on my yum. Acknowledging that there's a range of things that people like or don't like, right? And then what might be some other things that could be part of our group agreements today as we're talking to make sure that people feel comfortable in this space? Other ideas? Yeah?
Non-judgmental language.
Non-judgmental language. What would be like an example of that?
Then speak more in general terms instead of you or I, or instead of making it personal,
rather
maybe a more scientific or professional terminology use.
Yeah, so I hear you bringing up a couple of different things. One, maybe not making things really personal, either about your own self or somebody else as you're talking about it. And then also language, right? So there's a wide range of language when it comes to sexuality and sex education, things that people may be really comfortable with. There was this activity back when I used to teach sex ed that we would do where we would have this grid on the wall, on the board, and we would say, okay, what are all the slang terms you know for penis? What are all the slang terms you know for vagina? What are all the slang terms for sex? And then what are all the slang terms we have for arm, right? And there's not really, we don't have a lot of slang terms, right, for arm. People are limb, but limb isn't only specific to the arm, right? It could be our leg, too. So why do you think it is that we have so much range of language when it comes to things related to our sexual body parts or sexuality? Why do we have so much slang rather than just clear terminology?
Yeah, because people might feel uncomfortable with it, so they have to use more, I guess, aggressive terms or more stuff like that, just to make them feel more comfortable with saying.
Okay, yeah. So a range of comfort, and maybe being less comfortable, use some slang words. Other ideas? Yeah.
Maybe you want a chance to degrade someone for something, and you can use your words to do so.
Gotcha. So using specific language in a sexual way as a way of degrading somebody?
So, with parents, they use, instead of using penis and vagina, they use their terms because they feel like their child's too young to know those terms, like penis and vagina, and that could be, the start of, not of being sex positive, or, doing that, so.
Yeah, totally. I know when I used to teach with parents, a lot of parents would say, oh, I'm going to, I teach my kid that their vagina is called their peach or something like that, or their flower, or whatever it might be. And there's actually, a lot of reasons for why not to do that. You brought up one, just what does that communicate? You said kind of not as sex positive.
Yeah, not sex positive, and, it could also create, issues, if they're in class, oh, don't touch my peach, and, they're like, oh, you're not touching my peach. It could be, because there's so many different things that can mean that, so it's,
Yeah, so I've heard that too, right? That even just for empowering your child to be able to communicate if something is or isn't going on in a school setting or a daycare setting, if someone would be touching them inappropriately, that if you're not using common language, that could create confusion. Definitely. All right, so agreements for not yucking on our yums, to use not super personalized language, and to be aware of what kind of terminology we're using, and to steer clear of things that maybe would feel more offensive for people. Any other group agreements that we want to bring in? Yeah.
Maybe not what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but if something is shared it's very personal, to not have it go out. So Dr. Halley said he likes working with leaders. Maybe that shouldn't be mentioned in ISQs.
Very nice.
Just saying.
Nice. Just hypothetically. Yeah, that's great. But confidentiality, and as counselors, we definitely follow that belief of confidentiality, creating a space where what is said here is going to stay here. We're not going to share information that people are sharing here. Thanks. That's a great one. Any others? Okay. Well, if all of those agreements sound pretty good to everyone, well, then we'll move forward with that understanding of how we're going to continue with the conversation today. I think we're in that. Oh, do you want to introduce this?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
So someone mentioned the Vegas rule, and when I teach about sex and sexuality, I call it the modified Vegas rule, because we don't want to share, and Hannah said this, we don't want to share personal information that people may share. But I absolutely hope that you take information out of here that's factual, evidence-based, non-stigmatizing, and sex positive, and share that with your friends, family, neighbors, strangers, whoever needs to hear it. So that's why I call it the modified Vegas rule, because I do hope you take that information out and proliferate it. One of the words that is just so often misused is actually the word sexuality. If I were to ask you to describe your personality, you could start off with any number of things that you think make up your personality. You might pick hobbies, you might pick your career, you might pick to tell me that you're partnered or not, you might tell me about a success you've had, talents you have, struggles you've had. You could start off anywhere. Chances are, though, that if I were to ask you to describe your sexuality, after you told me to buzz off in my business, you'd probably use words like straight, bi, gay, because we think sexuality means sexual orientation. That's not it. Sexuality, just like personality, is everything that you could possibly think to talk about that describes you as a sexual person. Just like your personality is everything you could possibly think about to describe you as a person, sexuality is everything that describes you as a sexual person. Not just your sexual orientation. And in fact, I'm going to share a model with you that shows you actually truly how little of your sexuality is your sexual orientation. It's actually not a huge part of your sexuality. It's actually pretty small. Now, for some people, they might put more priority and more of their identity into their sexual orientation, and that's cool. When you think about all the things that I'm going to share with you, it's actually a pretty small mathematical part of your sexuality. Yeah. We're going to go through each of these individually, but I'll give you kind of the overall picture. This is a model that was created back in the 60s. The fact that the last model of holistic sexuality was created in the 60s should tell you something. It's been a little while. It's in need of an update. It's called the circles of sexuality. And there are these 5 circles that capture everything that makes you sexual, a sexual being in the world. We're going to go through them all in detail. I'm just going to kind of summarize them here. The first is the top one. There's no order to them. The top one there is sensuality. That's the desire to kind of be physically connected with someone. Not necessarily in a sex kind of way, but in like cuddling, holding hands, walking close to someone, kissing, head massage. It's that physical kind of desire to be touched. That's part of your sexuality. Some people have a lot of this and crave a lot of this and desire a lot of this. Some people don't. And if you're a cat, it's very unpredictable. But that's what sensuality is. Intimacy is the non-physical desire for connection. And we're going to talk about what that entails, but think about it in terms of like trust and how connected you are to someone by using how much you trust them and they trust you as a measurement of that. Some people like to have a lot of intimacy in their sexuality. Some people don't. It can go back and forth depending on context. But intimacy is that non-physical desire for connection. I'm going to skip that one for now. Reproduction and sexual health. This actually has a lot of different names. Sometimes people call it sexual health and behavior. This is the section we think of when we think of sex. So this is all your fantasies, all your desires, all the things you're into. This also includes sexual health information, reproductive health information. That all fits in this one. And again, we're going to go in detail into all of them. Sexualizations. That's largely talking about the social messaging around sex. And usually this circle is interpreted to mean the negative messaging around sex that we see often in the media, but also within society. What society tells you should look like, how society tells you should act. It's like, and some people even describe the sexualization circle as the weaponization of sex. So withholding sex as punishment. So if you're in a relationship, it's, well, they didn't do this thing, so I'm just not going to put out for them. That goes in this circle too. And then the last one is identity, sexual identity. There are 4 main parts of sexual identity. We're going to talk about them all in detail, but for now, just the overview. The first is biological sex, what's between your legs. The second is gender identity, what's between your ears, or how you identify. Third is gender expression, how you communicate your gender to the world. We're going to talk about that in more detail, of course. And then the last is sexual orientation, to whom you are sexually and or romantically attracted. So to go back to my first point about misusing the word sexuality, sexual orientation is actually only 1/4 of this identity circle, and the identity circle is actually only 1/5 of sexuality. So for you math folks, I guess that makes sexual orientation 1/20, right, of sexuality. And so limiting the conversation of what's your sexuality, or describe your sexuality, or how would you describe your sexuality, to sexual orientation is really limiting this conversation about sexuality to 1/20 of what you could really be talking about. We're going to go through all the circles in detail. This is really what the purpose of our talk is to expand on each of these circles and help people understand how their sexuality is just so diverse and so unique and so vast, and to appreciate that. Sweet. More me. Lucky you. So intimacy is first. As I said, intimacy is the non-physical desire for touch or connection. The words that I most frequently put with this is trust and vulnerability. How vulnerable do you feel in front of the people in your life? Not just your sexual partners, but just in general. Think about the people that you describe as your friends or as your family. How do you know when you can feel vulnerable in front of them, when you can open up to them? Or how much you can trust them with certain parts of you? That's what this is. It's modeled pretty early in life. A lot of us might have been in families where certain family members had secrets from other family members, maybe based strictly on gender roles. Boys sit together, don't tell mom. Those kind of things. How do you learn who you can trust in your family? What behaviors of the other person show you that they're trustworthy? How do you communicate to someone that you're trustworthy? How do you know when it's safe to be vulnerable? You learn all that as a child, and then you take a lot of that into your later life sexual relationships. The circles interact with each other. If your trust or your vulnerability is damaged in some way, so someone cheats on you, there's infidelity, or someone violates your trust, particularly in a sexual relationship, it can cause what we call referred pain to other parts of your sexuality. Referred pain is actually a biological phenomenon. Your body sometimes can't quite get your brain to understand what part of your body is not functioning. So it actually makes a nearby part of your body hurt. So there might be something wrong with your intestines, but it feels like it's your stomach because your body has referred the pain to your stomach. So your brain can more easily interpret, hey, I've got something down here that's amiss. Sexuality kind of does the same thing. This might manifest as there's infidelity in the marriage, and then one of the partners suddenly feels like they can't be as sexy anymore. So they might even change the way they dress. It's hurt their ability to maybe dress as sexy as they used to, or to do sexy things, or to go out and feel like a sexy person, because their intimacy circle is damaged. It affects the other circles too. Some of us may have been in that situation. But then, like any of the circles, this intimacy can be leveraged within sexual experiences. Maybe some folks like or prefer sexual encounters that don't have a lot of intimacy, or there's not a lot of need for trust or vulnerability. They like the idea of there not needing to be this deep, intimate connection. Other people might prefer to have sex only with people that they really feel like they can trust on a deep level, that really get to see a deep part of them. Some people might prefer one over the other different parts in their lives, or even within a menstrual cycle, because there's research that suggests that too. Sexuality evolves day to day. When you're in your 20s, you might prefer a certain level of intimacy in your sexual encounters. When you're in your 40s and 50s, you might desire a different level. That's this intimacy circle at play It's not bad. You're not broken or anything. It's just that your sexuality is evolving. So that's the intimacy circle. It's that non-physical part, the kind of abstract connection between people. Questions about intimacy?
Sorry, Sierra speaking. My question is about how much would you say that your experience of growing up impact your level of intimacy and your reaction to intimacy?
This is not a cop-out. The answer to that question genuinely depends on who you ask. And the reason I say that is there are so many theories of psychology and sexology that it depends on who you ask. So I'm going to give you my answer. I'm a cognitivist as a therapist, and so I focus on the internal messages that we tell ourselves over and over and over again. So if you tell yourself, I suck, I suck, I suck, I suck, you're going to respond a certain way. If you have an internal message of people are dangerous and untrustworthy, people are dangerous and untrustworthy, people are dangerous and untrustworthy, you're going to have a certain experience of life. So I look for these internal dialogues. And so when it comes to how I think about early life, in all the circles, but intimacy since that's what we're on, there's a theory of psychology called cognitive theory, like I referenced earlier, that says that those early schemas, a schema is like this core, deep down way that you believe the world works. And that those can get instilled and reinforced early in life. And I'm going to exaggerate for a second, but early in life, if you come from a certain family makeup, you might hear the message over and over again, men are untrustworthy, men are untrustworthy, men are untrustworthy. And if that's the dialogue that you're surrounded by, eventually that works its way in. So then you hear, men are untrustworthy. So your intimacy circle gets damaged. Not damaged, I don't say that. It gets informed by these early messages. And then that informs how you bring that into a possible sexual relationship with someone who fits the category of man, because men are untrustworthy. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Thanks. 10 out of 10. What about you? Anyone else? Intimacy circle?
Okay, so the next circle that we're going to talk about is the circle of sensuality. So just hearing that, what comes up for you? Like, what do you think of when you hear sensuality?
Yeah, I think kind of like of my own preferences or an individual's preferences and what they find. I don't want to use the word sensual, but sensual and appealing.
Can you give me some examples? Not necessarily like personal ones, but just what somebody might say.
I guess when you say like, well, my type is, and then you go on and you list your type, and that's typically who you're kind of like, I'm into this. Or I guess when you're even with a person, you say like it was very sensual and something like that. It can be something as much as like the way that they touch you or the way that they speak or something that attracts you to them.
Okay, so these things that are, like part of it, what attracts you, whether that be like touch or what you hear, how they talk to you. Yeah, so it's these things that really engage our senses, right? So it's using all parts of our senses as, so that's where the sensuality comes from, right? So it's awareness, acceptance, and enjoyment of one's own and other people's bodies is what goes into this realm of sensuality. So taking enjoyment of pleasure in our senses and how we receive information, how we experience ourselves or other people through our senses, through our bodies. So, as I just said, engaging senses, oral or visual stimuli. What might be an example of that? Like either of those things, oral stimuli or visual stimuli. Were you going to go ahead?
I guess like fellatio.
Okay, yeah, fellatio. Mm-hmm.
Cunnilingus.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Other ideas?
Cunnilingus.
Do you want to explain?
Providing oral sex to an individual with a vagina.
And if you want to, will you explain why you described it the way you just did, based on like body part?
Because you can have someone who society may identify as a man that has a vagina, and you may have someone who might. I'm tripping myself up.
No, it's all good.
But you may have someone who you may think is a female, and they have female and male do not describe the body parts.
Right. So that goes into people's gender identity rather than necessarily like their biological sex, right? And as Dr. Z said, we'll get more into that when we talk about the identity circle. But I really appreciate that you did use inclusive language when you talked about a body part rather than just a gender identity. All right, well, what about skin hunger? What is that concept, skin hunger? Have you heard that before, that term? A little bit? You may have heard it before? Okay, what might go into that, skin hunger? Yeah?
I'm so sorry, but the need to touch, especially one thing that I think of is when babies are born and infants are born and they need the skin contact with mothers in order to create what I would like to say plays into intimacy, and just to have that bond with the mom, and so that's what I immediately think of when I think of skin hunger.
Yeah, and I really, what you said brought up two things for me. One, brings in this idea of sexuality existing throughout our entire lifetime, right? Like people will say sometimes it's like from like before you were even born until you die, we are sexual beings, right? We have sexuality. So again, going back to this shift in thinking of, this fear-based model around sexuality and sexuality education, that sex or sexuality doesn't just start when we hit puberty or when we first have to start getting these sex ed classes in school or something, but that we're sexual beings our whole lives. And so your point to, babies, especially there's research that's been done with premature babies that if they're held, if they have that physical touch, that they actually oftentimes have better outcomes than babies that are premature that aren't being held, right? So it talks about that desire that we have to be touched or cuddled, or and that is like a real need of ours as people, for a lot of people. How about body image? What's the idea of body image, and how would that fit into this circle of sensuality? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
I would say what you find visually appealing and how you think the world perceives you and how you want to be perceived by the world and how you think other people and their visual sensuality and their preferences, how you want to play into it.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, it goes back again to what we were talking about it as awareness, acceptance, or enjoyment of your body or other people's bodies. So how you feel about the body. And there was this interesting study that I was looking up and researched as we were preparing for this. And it was a study that was looking at whether or not heterosexual, lesbian, or bisexual women experience different levels of body satisfaction or dissatisfaction related to their sexual orientation. And then also like whether or not they experience sexual satisfaction, so not even just like body satisfaction, and if there was a difference that existed. And basically this study, what it was talking about was that all of the women across the board experienced similar levels of like body dissatisfaction or sexual satisfaction or dissatisfaction, that there wasn't a big change in the sexual orientation and how that influenced them, that maybe that like idea of a male gaze on like what's expected of their bodies seems somewhat true across the board, regardless of their orientation. But one thing that they did see was that women who were in lesbian relationships didn't always have the same correlation between like body dissatisfaction and sexual dissatisfaction. So that's kind of an interesting study. And then how about physical fantasies or physical pleasure? What might that look like in the sensuality realm?
I guess like role playing.
Okay, role playing. Can you tell me more about what you're thinking about with that?
So I guess like maybe physical fantasies, like maybe they want to like do the whole doctor thing.
Okay, yeah.
Or
Yeah, so role playing, and how would that become part of like a sensual experience?
I guess like by doing that you're like bonding with your partner.
Okay, physically enjoying your body and their body through the role playing experience brings in the trust. So yeah, another thing, and this was the other thing I was going to touch on before with your comment and that you're bringing up, is that we're seeing a lot of overlap, right? Like you're like, oh, this is part sensuality, but also it requires maybe some intimacy for some people, or maybe for other people it might not require as much intimacy. Yeah, So that's one of the interesting things about when we talk about sexuality in this way, is this overlap of how do these circles interact with one another. Well, other questions or thoughts about sensuality, that circle?
What role does sensuality play with so I've heard of an oral fixation that most people have as a natural human fixation, and what role does sensuality play with that?
That's an interesting question. So, Dr. Z, do you want to answer? Or you try to answer? Okay. So, well, the oral fixation idea, at least my understanding of it from like a counseling lens, is that Freud was somebody who thought about how we have stages of development, and that if there's a particular oral stage of development, and that if someone doesn't have their particular needs, I guess, right, at that oral stage, then they would develop like an oral fixation, right, throughout their life. So again, that's like a particular theoretical understanding. Everybody might not come with that theoretical background of saying, oh, okay, if you don't develop this at this particular time period in your development, then you're going to have this oral fixation. So that's like the first way I would address it a little bit. But in terms of sensuality, I guess, yeah, if you bring it into this like broader idea of being like, okay, yeah, if somebody enjoys oral sex, giving or receiving it, then that would be an element, right, of this sensuality of experiencing enjoyment of somebody's body and somebody else's, someone's own body and somebody else's body. Does that kind of answer your question? Or what are your thoughts?
I'm not sure if it's purely a Freudian
Right, if it's
aspect
broader.
of oral fixation, or because it seems like within the wide variety and the wide range of sex that two partners can have or multiple partners can have, there just always seems to be some degree of focus on oral something, whether it's oral sex, whether it's kissing, whether it's licking something, whether it's anything in the mouth ever. It seems like there is some kind of role that oral something plays within sex.
Yeah, that's an interesting like way of framing it like that, and it makes me think too of like babies, right? Like a lot of how they experience or understand like what's going on in the world is by bringing things into their mouth, right? Like and it just also makes me think a little bit of how like when we think about sensuality and our senses, are we always like in touch with our different senses, or are there some that we lean more toward than others, right? Like our mouth, our like taste and smell sense, we are engaging with all the time when we're eating food, when we're drinking things, right? But are there parts or types of our senses that we maybe don't engage with as much, like I don't know, our sight or our hearing, and how that plays in. But yeah, that's an interesting thought. Do you have thoughts on it? Yeah. Well, you're next up. Yeah. Oh no, you're not. I was just going to talk about these.
Oh, you want me to? So I'll answer your question. Sorry, y'all. We said this wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, but it is.
So that's a great question. So Hannah's 100% right, and as her theories instructor nailed the Freudian oral stage. What we now know, so there's actually an area there's two areas in your brain. They run sideways, coronally, right? And they're called the homunculi. Has anybody heard that term before, homunculi? It's probably come up actually in this field, right, studying homunculi. But now that I think about it, and one of the homunculi is your sensory homunculi. And the idea behind, I don't even know how to spell it, I'm sorry, y'all. Homunculi? One is homunculus. Homunculus. Well, yeah, plural would be homunculi.
That's right.
Is it two eyes, maybe? I won a spelling bee in middle school. So
Oh
my God.
Ooh.
Good soft brag.
So, whatever it is, we'll call it the H. In your brain, one of them is the sensory homunculus. And in your brain, the amount of cortex, so the amount of physical brain dedicated to processing input from different parts of your body is actually not proportionate to the size of that body part. It's actually, the proportionality is based off of how much you use that body part. So you have considerably more brain brain dedicated to receiving input from your mouth than you do, for example, your back or the tops of your feet. Bottom of your feet are a little different because you need that for balance. But top of your feet, not a lot of brain for that. Not a lot of brain for what we call the trunk. There's a ton of homunculus space for your mouth, your genitals, your fingertips. And so that's one reason why we see so much oral play in sex. Is there's just literally a ton of brain dedicated to understanding what's going on with your mouth. Same thing with the anus. There's a ton of space in your brain dedicated to understanding sensory input from the anus. Now, a lot of that is you can control your bowels, but what feels good feels good. So if there's a lot of brain space dedicated to it, your brain finds interaction with those senses satisfying. It's the same reason, fun fact, I love fun facts when it comes to sex, but the nerve, I don't know how to demonstrate this in a professional way, the nerve that runs just under your buttock, so right where like the line is, if you were standing up, like where your butt folds back in, I don't know if the technical buttock is. The nerve that runs just under there is the same nerve that in people with vulvas runs along the labia majora. And so that's why butt massages might feel particularly interesting. It's the same nerve. So someone's Googling it right now. Or texting their partner going, listen, I need a butt massage.
Like, this needs to happen now.
I'm just saying, like, remind me later, I have a story about butt massage.
And so, like, input from those, if you know where the nerves are, it all is you're just playing with someone's homunculus, and so it feels very pleasurable when if you can understand it. And so much of my work down at the sex therapy clinic is helping people know where their nerves are and where their sensory kind of things go and where their partners go. That's some of the most fun of my job. Hannah.
Just asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Will you explain that part again one more time? The where in the fuck is
Like, so if someone were,
like
I'm
your
going to
back
try to draw
and
it.
then not your back? Is it over here?
So, like, if you're standing, right, so this is someone's back, and then you got the donkey back and then their leg. The nerve right there. So right where, like, the butt folds back into the leg. The crease, yeah, not your butt crack, the butt crease.
Isn't it like called like the? Isn't it like this?
Not the
different
right here.
Right where your butt like faces with your back.
Right there.
Right here.
Alright, I just like asking for a friend, so it's like cool, but...
If I had more flattering jeans on, it might be easier to but it's connected to the same part that runs just underneath the labia majora. Other fun fact, the clitoris actually extends back into the body and loops back around under the labia majora. So pressure on the labia majora actually also stimulates the clitoris, because the clitoris actually extends back into the body. So it is the penis, but it's you can stimulate the clitoris by stimulating the labia majora as well. So that answered your question about oral play. Yeah. So now I'm going to step back away. Hope that was fun for everyone.
Good. Yeah, that was helpful. That was really good. So 2 examples that I found related to incorporating sensuality more into sexuality education, because a lot of times that's a thing that's not necessarily like included in a lot of traditional sex education. And so I found this first example. It was talking about adolescent mothers. So, and I saw this a lot in my work in a adolescent sexual health clinic, is that there's oftentimes like a lot of funding for sexuality education geared at or like pointed at teen parents, right? Because there's a lot of like negative perception of teen parents oftentimes, and how do we prevent that? And so this study, what they did was they looked at, okay, well, we're going to be working with adolescent mothers no matter what, because we have this like funding for it. How can we make this be more sex positive, right? Like more of a holistic sexuality education approach. And so what they did was they brought sensuality more into the education experience in 2 particular ways. The first was that they did this activity called body mapping, where they had people like trace their bodies and then talked about, there were prompts related to different parts of the body and like how to think about your body and like bringing people more into their bodies rather than this more like heady conversation that we often have about sexuality. And then the other thing they did was they had the young women like design what their ideal form of birth control would be, like make it, like make it with art supplies and things like that. So again, bringing things more into the body, more into this visceral experience, because there's actually research on that's how we learn more too, right? Is when we do things actually with our bodies. So incorporating that. And then the second example that I found was talking about this concept of safe sensuality. And this was an experience about middle-aged women who were taking a salsa dancing class. And it was these women who found themselves like single later on in life and had this need still for like skin hunger, right? For touch, for connection. But were looking for it not in like by going out to bars or pubs. Didn't really feel like safe or comfortable in those types of spaces. And so they found this ability to be close with another person and to engage their senses through salsa dance class. And so the researcher who was talking about this used this term safe sensuality, thinking about like ways of getting those sensual needs met, but in a different way. So part of the reason why I like bringing in that example, again, is talking about sexuality throughout our lifetime and how there's all these different circumstances that occur throughout people's lives. Like a lot of these women who were interviewed in this were talking about like where are the places for me to talk about as a middle-aged single woman what my now like sexual experience is and my sexual identity and how do I get these sexual parts of myself back. So that's why I pulled that one as an interesting example. Questions about either of those?
So